The National Religious Retirement Office is pleased to present Tending the Vineyard, 5 video presentations to help you with your planning and management of property issues. We are grateful to the Conrad and Hilton Foundation for providing the funding for this project. And we are grateful to Brother Stephen Glodek, who is the project manager for Tending the Vineyard, for bringing this project to fruition. These videos are meant for leaders, your staff, your sisters, and anyone who is a stakeholder on one of your committees or otherwise helps you manage or assess your property. We are also very grateful to the presenters of in these videos. Skip Hedger will be the host and main presenter, and he will be giving you factual information, vocabulary, and other resources for your property planning. Sister Susan Shorston and Sister Helen Carney will be responding to the material. Sister Susan brings vast experiences as a leader in her own congregation and as a frequent consultant for the National Religious Retirement Office. Sister Helen is the leader of her congregation, and during her term of office, she has had practical experience with many of the property issues you'll be hearing about. We are grateful for everyone participating, and we hope that you will find this material helpful and useful in your property planning for the future.
Hello, my name is Skip Hedger, and I will be your host for each of 5 educational sessions being produced as part of NRRO's Tending the Vineyard initiative. As your host, I'll have a dual role. First, I will present information and materials specifically developed for each of these 5 sessions. I should say from the beginning that these materials have are deliberately designed to be practical and focus on the how-to of strategic property planning. The second role I will have as your host is that after having presented some of these information and materials, I will engage 2 women religious in conversations about the materials just presented. As Sister Stephanie mentioned, with us for this session and each session will be Sister Helen Carney. She is a sister of St. Joseph of Brentwood and is currently in her 2nd term as president of the congregation. And Sister Susan Shorston. She is the Sister of the Humility of Mary, and as Sister Stephanie said, is a previous pastoral leader of her congregation. Let me give you an idea of how our time together the next 2 hours will be structured generally. First, as I mentioned, I will present information and materials that has been specifically developed for these educational sessions. I'll present these materials using PowerPoint slides. Following presentation of materials in each segment, Sisters Helen and Susan and I will have a conversation related to the materials just presented. After all of the segments, all the materials have been presented and the conversations have happened, I'll briefly wrap up each session. I'll do that by providing a full list of all the tools and resources that have been developed to support each session and tell you how you can access those materials online. One goal we have for these sessions is to make you aware of these tools and resources that have been developed to help religious institutes in the U.S. who are either engaged in strategic property planning or are thinking about undertaking strategic property planning. Our hope is that you see these materials as a library that you can go to when you have a particular need or want information on a specific topic related to strategic property planning. So we hope you benefit from and enjoy these sessions. There's no need to watch each of them in sequence. There are 5 of them, as I mentioned, and you may watch those in any way that fits your interest at the time. So thank you for your attention, and we'll begin now the session. With that introduction, we present Strategic Property Planning Session number 4, Navigating the Course. The material presented in this session focuses on how to manage a strategic property planning process once it's underway. To give you a brief synopsis of this session, once preparations for strategic property planning have been made and professional advisors have been selected, design a detailed process and timetable around the Institute's strategic property planning goals. Use this detailed process and timetable, coupled with well-planned meetings, to help manage and assess ongoing progress. Communicate frequently and honestly with the Institute's professional advisors during the implementation process to maintain progress and momentum and to keep the planning process on track. In this session 4, we will cover the following topics: organizing the strategic property planning process, managing the strategic property planning process, communications required to support strategic property planning, options and alternatives developed through strategic property planning, managing professional advisors, and finally, controlling costs. 2 things to know as this session begins. First, there may be terms you hear that are not familiar to you. You should know that a glossary of terms for this session and each session is available online on the Tending the Vineyard page of the NRO section of the USCCB website at usccb.org. Each time you see a phrase or a word appear in blue in this presentation, that means it's included on the glossary. Secondly, a series of practical tools and resources to support this session are also available online at this same location. There are 19 of these for session 4, in addition to the glossary. These tools and resources are shown in red, so anytime you see something on a slide that appears in red, that means there is a tool and resource with that name available on the USCCB website. We're going to start this session at a little different place than the others. We'll begin with a brief conversation with our 2 sisters who are on the panel, Sister Susan Shorston and Sister Helen Carney. The first 3 of these sessions on strategic property planning have been about preparing for planning. The next 2 will be about managing the planning process and then implementing the results of the planning process. So as we make the shift from preparing to doing, what do you think would be the concerns or anxieties that might be quite common at this point for a religious institute after having made these preparations, and now the time has come to really implement the process and whatever comes out of that process? What would you think would be common?
I think one of the common elements is there's some sense of relief that we've begun the process. Mm-hmm. I think there's anxiety because we don't know what are the unknowns that we're going to face. Mm-hmm. I think it's probably a mixed bag of now we can get on to perhaps other business while some of this is happening. Mm-hmm. So I think it's different people are going to react differently. Mm-hmm. But I think relief in one sense. I think anxiety or fear of the unknown. Mm-hmm. It also would be concerns about what might be the challenges that we don't even have a clue that we're going to have to deal with. So that's a part of the unknown, I think. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a both and. It's not an either or. Mm-hmm.
Sister Helen, you've been through this fairly recently. It's been a few years.
I would agree wholeheartedly. There's a very nice sense of accomplishment. You've hired a professional and you've gotten through that phase, and then you realize there's a big job ahead. So there is that anxiety. There is a fear of the unknown. I think sometimes looking ahead it seems huge. But again, what you have to really rely on is the fact that you have engaged a professional and there is help in the process. We begin the process as we'll be talking about it. You set timelines and you set goals. And that ordering in the process is an encouragement. But there's also the sense, too, that this will be pointing to some difficult areas that may, cause some real worry in terms of, sacred spaces, important places, the ways we're used to doing things. But having been through the process, so I'm moving to the end instead of the beginning, it gives us a lot of opportunity and hope to look at things differently that will enable, the mission to continue.
What advice generally would the two of you have for leaders of religious institutes at this point in the process where they're ready to go? Or does anything come to mind that you think would be useful to a religious institute that finds itself in this position now, having hired a professional advisor and ready to begin? Any words of encouragement or advice?
One, I think, is always to remember why we're doing what we're doing. And that is for the mission. Secondly, it's to be patient with the process. Third, it's to get in touch with your own personal feelings, fears, anxieties about what might be the outcome, and not set yourself apart from that. It's what the members are going to be experiencing as well. There's some of their fears and anxieties, and I think being in touch with that and perhaps being able to verbalize that so that the members know that you're on, in some ways, on the same track that they're on.
Because after all, you're a member too,
right,
and have the same feelings that other members have. Sister Helen?
I would agree. Don't bury what you're feeling. I think it's important too. And remember, you have a team. And to be able to express your questions, to express the anxiety over something, you have a professional consultant to work with, and that person has experience. And to be able to trust that process, to go with it. And I think what you're saying, Susan, is really important. The membership and the leadership and the planning team all have to acknowledge this from the beginning. I remember standing at an assembly and saying, we have a very large task ahead of us, but we're doing it together. And I think when you invite that sense of this is our process, and this is something that we'll work on together, you're not standing alone. And in leadership, sometimes you feel that way, and it's not the case.
I think something that Helen mentioned earlier in one of the sessions, that their congregation had a prayer. And I think encouraging leaders to put this whole process in the context of prayer, whether it's a prayer that they remember every morning or that individual sisters pray, they pray together as a community, but keeping it in the context of prayer, that this is really looking at what is God asking of us at this time in our history of our institute or of our congregation.
I affirm that wholeheartedly.
Thank you, sisters, for your perspectives. We'll now move on through this session on strategic property planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Skip.
We're going to begin this segment of strategic property planning session 4, talking about organizing the property planning process, beginning with developing a detailed strategic planning process description as a first step. What this is really a comprehensive depiction of how the Religious Institute plans to go about its strategic property planning and the timetable for it. It requires thinking through again how the strategic property planning process will be structured and timed, but at a different level. It's designed around the Religious Institute's goals for strategic property planning naturally, and it builds on and is consistent with, but is not the same as, the process described in an accepted proposal. It is more thorough and detailed. The process that a professional advisor may describe and that you accept should be viewed as a starting point, and the Institute should build on that and adapt it and refine it as the Institute desires as part of this process of developing a detailed strategic planning process description. 3 purposes of developing this description are to establish a roadmap for the whole process, the strategic property planning process, to become the basis for monitoring and assessing planning progress, and to clearly demonstrate the Institute's commitment to member engagement. Generally, a good detailed property planning process description has 7 components. It talks about a clear statement and describes the Religious Institute's goals for strategic property planning. It explicitly recognizes and articulates values and principles that will guide the strategic planning process. It identifies each major planning phase. It includes a description of the major activities that will happen in each phase. It delineates roles for all those who have been involved, for all those who will be involved in strategic property planning. And obviously, as has been said earlier in other sessions, the importance of role clarity for final decisions is essential. It includes a plan for member engagement so that members have the information and tools needed to engage at the level the Institute desires. And both of these points, roles and member engagement, have been themes that have run through other sessions in this series. But this is the point in the process where those decisions get finalized and memorialized in a detailed planning process description. Seventh, a comprehensive timetable to assure planning has a beginning, a middle, and an end. One of the tools available online is summary information on the components of a detailed strategic property planning description, and that information builds on these 7 points I just made. Moving next to the typical phases of strategic property planning. Strategic property planning is a process that's best organized into discrete phases. Typical phases include a planning and preparation phase, during which initial data and information is collected and the planning structure, whatever it is put into place. A detailed assessment phase, during which review and analysis occurs for properties and in other areas important to the Institute. Part of the message from these sessions is to encourage a broader view when an institute engages in strategic property planning. So there may be other assessments besides properties and their uses that are relevant and that are helpful to undertake during a strategic property planning process. These could involve membership assessment of membership demographics. It could involve finances and financial viability. So there could be a number of assessments that happen in this phase, each of which would be an assessment that the Religious Institute has determined is worthwhile. An articulation of realities phase, during which the Religious Institute defines specific realities relevant to strategic property planning. That's the third phase. Fourth, and building on the realities, is the setting of priorities phase, during which the most critical realities to be addressed in the Institute's strategic property planning are identified. It could be that many realities are identified in the process through the assessments and through the data. But which of these are most important and most essential for the Institute to address in its strategic property planning process? So there's a phase that establishes those priorities for planning. Fifth, an options and alternatives development phase, during which specific alternatives and scenarios are identified and evaluated. Sixth, a recommendations development and decision-making phase, during which the actions the Religious Institute will take as part of its planning are determined. And finally, an implementation phase, during which the Religious Institute implements the decisions it makes. There's a list and description of typical phases of strategic property planning process available online, and it builds on and provides additional information about each of the phases just identified. There are timing considerations as the Institute develops its detailed strategic property planning process description, and there are many factors and variables that affect a planning timetable. Some of these include the scope of strategic property planning, whether the Institute is large and has many properties or smaller and has fewer properties, will affect the timing. The complexity overall of the religious institute. Larger institutes generally are more complex and may require more time and affect the planning timetable. The number and nature of assessments the religious institute decides to undertake as part of its strategic property planning process. The fewer the assessments the institute decides to undertake, the less time required, the more time required. The level of membership engagement the religious institute desires is also a factor that can affect timing. A decision to connect planning to major events or gatherings already on the calendar for the institute is a variable that can affect timing. An institute may have a chapter or a large gathering or an assembly or some other gathering scheduled and already on the calendar and decides it would be good to have some major phase or even completion of a strategic property planning process at that time, coinciding with that date already on the calendar. And so that may be a variable that affects the planning timetable. The fact that the world doesn't stop while an institute plans is also a factor that affects the timetable. That those, whatever those things are that happen are unpredictable and can't be factored in and may or may not occur, but the world does not stop while an institute plans, and things that happen unanticipated can affect the planning timetable. So a list of factors and variables, including these and others, is one of the resources that is available online. The next aspect of organizing a strategic property planning process has to do with the meetings of the planning team or planning committee that has been structured for the purpose of strategic property planning. This planning team or committee can expect to meet with the professional advisor or advisors many times during planning. The number and timing of these meetings is driven by and consistent with the religious institute's detailed strategic property planning process. There are several general considerations for how meetings are timed. Major meetings are timed, and some of these include initial orientation and team building for the group with lead responsibility for planning, to familiarize themselves with the planning process and to build up a common understanding about it and make sure that the planning team's questions have been answered and their need for clarification has been addressed. Another consideration for when a meeting of a planning team would be useful is when information or learnings produced at the end of each of the phases I mentioned becomes available. After the assessments have been conducted, after the realities have been identified, after the priorities are emerging, those are typically good times for a meeting of the planning team or committee. Also, after members provide input, depending on the nature of this input, and by that I mean when the input that's being provided is at a key time in a planning process, that generally means the planning team or committee is going to want to meet after that input has been received. As preliminary and final recommendations are developed and introduced to members, how to do that, how to come to those conclusions involves a meeting or meetings of a planning team or committee. And certainly when it's time to make final decisions, the planning team or committee would need to meet to assess all the information and all the input and all the learning from their process and make final decisions about the recommendations that will be presented to leadership, presumably as part of a strategic property planning process. Available online is a tool that provides suggestions for developing a planning team or committee meeting schedule. That concludes this segment on organizing a strategic property planning process. Sisters, I just presented some information on organizing the Religious Institute for the process it's about to undertake. And I mentioned several factors that could affect the timetable, because it's good to have a timetable for a process so it does have a beginning, middle, and an end. And I identified some factors that can affect those. How did those resonate with you, or did you think of other ones? Other factors that could affect the timing of a strategic property planning process as depicted and planned as part of the process of getting ready to actually undertake the process?
Well, I think we've been talking about this as a process that's integrated into the life of the congregation. Mm-hmm. So it's not separate, and it's not going to be protected from things that happen. The steps from our own experience of gathering information, that type of process can sometimes meet some difficulties. If the organization of the information that you want isn't the way it should be, it takes a little bit longer. Our process was also parallel with directions from our chapter about the care of our elder sisters. And we had another consultant working with us. So gathering information from one source to be part of the planning process, it took a little bit longer, and yet it enriched the process. And very specifically, we were suffering from the effects of Hurricane Sandy. So financial information was very complicated at that point between what we were dealing with in terms of reports to FEMA and also getting information for the process. But it worked. It just sometimes was a little bit more complicated.
Sister Susan, what's your perspective on some of the things that can interrupt the best planning timetable?
I think that one of the major pieces for me is the unpredictability of obtaining the assessments or the data that is required. Mm-hmm. That it sometimes that does take longer because sometimes you're dependent on outside sources, mm-hmm. and that may, what you may hope to be accomplished within a relatively short time period, it may take longer to do that. Mm-hmm. I think the just happenings within the congregation itself, whether it's, as Helen said, it has to be integrated within the community's timetable. So chapters, jubilee celebrations, perhaps change in leadership could be a major interruption in the process, because if there is a change in leadership, it's the new people, perhaps elected to leadership, becoming more familiar with the details of the process itself. It's unexpected deaths that you may have something scheduled and then it doesn't get accomplished because of whatever was. So it's the natural happenings that go on within a community or congregation. It's the delay in obtaining information that you had hoped could be sooner but perhaps isn't. Or revealing some aspect of the information or the data now requires a further study that wasn't anticipated. And so there may be a delay because now we need to know more about something before we can really proceed. And how might that impact the schedule itself?
One of the items you mentioned is that not everything is within the control of the Religious Institute. So if there are assessments and the professional advisor is conducting those, and if that gets behind, that could affect the timetable. And that's a very appropriate comment for you to make for this session, which has to do with managing professional advisors and being attuned to developments like that, a timeline wasn't made or something like that. So, and certainly your comment about a change in leadership, while those ordinarily don't happen as a surprise, they're planned. Nonetheless, depending on where a process is in process, it can affect the timetable because, as you point out, new leaders, while they may have been involved, that members are now involved differently from their position of being in leadership.
I'm aware of one community where the leader of the congregation died in the midst of a planning process, and that in and of itself, that wasn't expected or anticipated, and how's that done? I also think, Skip, something that you just mentioned that goes back to some of what we talked about in the previous session was in interviewing the candidates for who might be the outside consultant who's working with, is to know also what the backup is if something does happen to that individual or individuals, because that's another potential interruption. If something happens, surgery is required, or there's a death in his or her family, or something unfortunate occurs, then how will the firm or the entity and who can pick that up? And so the backup is an important question to ask. And I don't know that we talked about that yesterday.
I think we may have touched on it briefly, that that's a good question to ask during an interview, is what's your backup plan
That's
in case something unexpected does happen?
I would also say that when you face delays, you don't want them to happen, no matter where they're coming from, but to go with it, because if you skip over things, it's going to inhibit the integrity of the process, and it usually does work out. It might take a little bit longer, but it works.
The other major content item just presented had to do with this detailed planning process and description, which, as I mentioned, is different from and builds on the process a professional advisor may have proposed. What are your thoughts about the value of having this detailed process description and timetable as I described it? Would you see that as being essential for a religious institute to develop, and how do you see that having a utility for the religious institute?
I think it's critical. I think you put forth the details and the aspects of the plan that you're putting forth, the phases, the information, the gathering of information, the timeline that would also include the meetings, the scheduling of meetings. And we kept that timeline in front of every communication. And when we had delays, when we realized the timeline that we put out was different, we explained why there was a delay. But it was an information piece for the leadership, for the planning committee, and also for the congregation. And it gives people a sense of knowing what to expect in light of that. And I think the complexity of each phase was described as we did that. So where we were getting information, as I mentioned before, there was another source of information. So we waited for responses from the congregation to the input from the consultant on aging, as well as the process. So each piece of that process was put forward, and each time we had a communication with the congregation, you would refer back to that.
And so building on that, how critical do you think it is that this detailed process description be introduced and explained to membership?
They need to know it up front, because if you haven't been part of a planning process, you don't realize that there are steps to get you to the end. Most women religious especially want to know what's going to happen. So here we are, we've started, so what's the results? But to know in between all of the phases is extremely important. And we did that through an assembly, a gathered assembly of the entire congregation, with follow-up smaller meetings to digest. What questions did you have about the planning process? What are your concerns? What do you want the consultant to know? And we gave all of that feedback to the consultant. That's when he named us Fiercely Independent Women.
Sister Susan, what are your perspectives about the value of having this roadmap?
I agree completely with what Helen has just said, because I think A, it needs to be done, B, it serves as the monitoring of where are we in this process. And as for sharing with the members, I think that's absolutely critical, but always a reminder of where we've been and where we're going. I think that integrating it into the communications, because again, I emphasize as all of us are aging and as our memories sometimes become shorter, it's like, how did we get here? Where did this come from? I think the where did this come from is one of the major questions that individual members might ask. And continuing that, reemphasizing here's where we've been, and it can be done succinctly and quickly and briefly, but it puts it out and here's where we're going. It keeps the framework out there. So I think it's critical for all involved, and that it is communicated and shared with. And when there is a hiatus in some aspect or component of it, just simply explaining why. It's give the rationale. It tells people why there's been a delay or why we've got stopped at this place or that place. The other thing I think trying to always be sensitive to as leaders is that we don't overwhelm our members with asking for too much information at any one time. And when Helen mentioned that they had another study trying to ascertain some of their elder care needs, if they're asking the sisters for information that's very personal about that, be careful that we're not asking them for something else at the same time. Mm-hmm. Because I think our members can feel overwhelmed with too much coming at them. Mm-hmm. So it's integrating those pieces yes, we want them all involved, but we need to be sensitive to the timing of how we get them involved and maintain their involvement.
Any closing comments as we continue to move from preparing to doing as regards a strategic property planning process?
Patience with the process.
Keep on keeping on.
Keep on keeping on, thank you. We just talked about organizing a strategic property planning process, and now we're going to move into a general conversation about managing a strategic property planning process. Strategic property planning is actually an important project, so an understanding of general project management principles can be helpful as the Institute manages the process it has signed on to and with the assistance of the professional advisors it has engaged. So what are some of these general project management principles that can be useful for religious institutes to understand? First, the ones that are applicable include the absolute need for clear definitions of a project and its scope. Ambiguity there leads often to failure of projects. So a clear definition of what the project is, in this case, strategic property planning, and the scope of that planning. Second is establishment of clear project goals. We've talked in some of these sessions about the importance of the Institute's goals and how it describes those in a statement of work and in other ways. Third, clearly defined roles and conformity of action to roles. Roles and clarity about roles has been an ongoing theme in these sessions up to now. So while it's also, while the clarity is important, conformity of action to roles is also important as a general project management principle. A strong commitment of leadership to the project is also a generally accepted project management principle. Without leadership support and commitment, projects are not going to be successful generally. Other project management principles that may apply: development of a detailed and integrated plan designed to achieve goals. Really what we've just been talking about, this concept of having a detailed strategic planning, property planning process description. A willingness and capacity to react to and accommodate unexpected changes is a general project management principle. And as we just heard in our conversation in this session, there are things that happen that are unexpected, that have an impact, and the process, the project has to be willing to and have the capacity to react to and accommodate those changes. Definition of critical project milestones is also a general project management principle that applies to a religious institute's strategic property planning. Transparency and honesty regarding project progress and status. You can't fool around with that. If a project's behind schedule or not where it was anticipated that it would be, that's got to be named and dealt with transparently and honestly. So there's a more elaborate summary of project management principles that may apply to strategic property planning that's available online. So moving from the general applicability of project management principles into some more specific ones relevant to an institute's strategic property planning. First, meetings as a process management tool. Well-planned and facilitated planning team or committee meetings are critical to effective management of strategic property planning. Some keys to successful meetings are careful planning of agendas, allows meeting time to be spent where it needs to be, and that is on the most relevant, important items at that moment. Also, including detailed written materials to support agenda items helps team or committee members come to meetings prepared, having read these materials, having thought about them, having reflected on them in advance of a meeting. And then naturally, distribution of a meeting agenda and the materials that support it sufficiently in advance of a meeting is also essential for that meeting to be as productive as it can be. There's few things that people like less than going to a meeting that's not productive and where you feel like you're spinning your wheels. Some of these preparations can make meetings more productive and keep that from happening. Also, having available detailed and substantive meeting summaries or minutes is another invaluable process management tool. A meeting summary does several things. It ensures greater clarity and common clarity among those who are at the meeting. If a meeting summary comes out and describes something that a participant in the meeting didn't see that way, that can be clarified, and a meeting summary can be a vehicle to provide that clarification. A meeting summary also documents the rationale for actions and decisions. In a strategic property planning process, many decisions are going to be made by a planning team or committee about the process, about next steps, about what to do with input. And all of that will be discussed and decided at meetings, and having a meeting summary that documents that rationale is very helpful. In part because it serves as a future point of reference. Strategic property planning doesn't happen in a month or 2 or 3. Usually it's an extended period of time. And there is some complexity to it, although manageable complexity. And it's not always immediately clear, well, how did we get to that point, or how did we make that decision? Having a substantive, detailed meeting summary helps as a future point of reference for prior decisions or rationale that a planning team or committee used to get to a specific point. A meeting summary memorializes the work of the planning team or committee, and if the religious institute chooses to archive that for the future, it would be a key piece of archival material for the institute, especially remembering that strategic property planning involves ordinarily very big decisions for an institute. So, as tools available online are additional discussion of general characteristics of well-planned and productive meetings and meeting agendas, and attributes, a more detailed discussion of attributes of useful meeting summaries. Communications is the next component of management of a strategic property planning process. I want to begin by talking about the purpose and scope of a communications plan and strategy, and you'll see that bolded and appearing in blue, so that means that's a term that's in the glossary that provides a specific definition about what we mean by communication plan and strategy. Having one it helps anticipate and provide for major communication needs, and the emphasis there is on anticipate what major communication needs are going to be in a strategic property planning process, and then providing for how those communications and when they will happen. Having a communications plan and strategy assures that members stay informed, and ordinarily that would be a specific component of a communication plan and strategy is how will communications with membership be structured and work? When will it happen? How will it happen? A communications plan and strategy can also provide guidance to members as to what they should or can and shouldn't or can't say about planning, because they're going to be in situations where the people they associate with who are not members are going to ask questions about what's going on within the Institute. What's this planning all about? We have talked and mentioned confidentiality as a critical part of strategic property planning, and it's helpful as part of a communication plan and strategy to provide some level of guidance, a level that's appropriate for the religious institute, as to what members should be comfortable saying and things that they should not be sharing with non-members of the institute. A communications plan and strategy helps keep all stakeholders informed, including associates, if the institute has associate members, employees. Most institutes have at least some employees. Some have many employees, and they're clearly a stakeholder in the future of a religious institute. Church officials, and how communications with church officials will happen and when they'll happen. Sponsored or supported ministries, who are clearly stakeholders of a religious institute, especially if they're located on the property that is within the scope of a strategic property planning process, but not only if they are. Regardless of their location, sponsored or supported ministries have a stake in the future of the religious institute and its planning for that future. Major benefactors are a stakeholder, clearly. And there are many others potentially. Neighbors, civic officials, among others, would be stakeholders in religious institutes' strategic property planning process. A communication plan and strategy also allows messages to be tailored to different audiences. An example of that would be, what do you communicate to employees when? The last thing you would want to do is have employees fear prematurely or wrongly for job security. So how communications with employees is structured with employees would also be a component of a communication plan and strategy, and there would be a tailored timing and message for each audience. And I just use employees as one example of an audience for whom communications could be tailored. The times a communication plan and strategy times communications to different needs to know. Not everybody has the same need to know. Members obviously have a strong need to know. Civic officials, they have some need to know, but when and what. Other stakeholders are the same way. So a communication plan and strategy allows an institute to tailor what it's communicating to different needs to know, to different stakeholders. A communications plan and strategy also anticipates and helps control rumors. It's quite common that in strategic property planning process, somewhere along the way, at the beginning, the middle, or the end, that rumors fly within the institute, and most of those rumors are untrue. But can grow legs and become more true as they're spread. So having a way to anticipate and control for rumors is an important part of a communications plan and strategy a religious institute may wish to develop. There are a number of resources and tools available online related to communications plan and strategy. First is a fuller list of potential stakeholders that could be included. Second are basic elements of an effective communication plan and strategy. These would cover the who communications would go to, the how communications would be distributed, the when communications would happen, and how frequently would be some of the elements of an effective communication plan and strategy. There's also a tool online that provides suggested talking points to guide member conversations about strategic property planning with others, with non-members. Again, those would need to be tailored to the specific needs and circumstances of the institute, but it's a beginning point. It's a beginning resource an institute can use to structure some talking points for its members to guide their conversations. And also, there is a resource on, with additional information on tips for controlling rumors and misinformation. That concludes this segment of this session on managing a strategic property planning process. We'll now talk with our panel members a little about this. Sisters, we just talked about managing a strategic property planning process, and I ended that with some information on how critical communications management is to a strategic property planning process. Could I get some of your thoughts about the importance of communications and what you see as being the most important audiences to communicate to, and how to do that and when to do that? Whatever thoughts you have about how critical it is for good communications as part of a strategic property planning process.
I would say it is very critical, and it's not separate from the process. So the timing of communication, certainly within the congregation itself, beginning there, has to do with what you're planning in terms of a larger assembly, a meeting of the planning committee, small area meetings. At every point of that process, there should be some communication about what is going to happen, and after the experience, that there is some feedback about what did happen. And the communications within the congregation were intimately related to the aspects of the process. In addition to that, I think we began probably not knowing who were the people who needed the communication. So it kind of went from center out. Staff had to know because they were going to be part of the information gathering. And it was just a matter of helping us as opposed to creating fear, you know, is something going to happen here? We did communicate with the bishop or diocesan community, so we let them know that we were in this process. We eventually communicated with our benefactors once the process was underway, because again, without knowing in a sense where the directions were going to take us, we didn't want to raise anxiety for the benefactors either. So the plan for communication kind of evolved along with the process to others outside of the congregation and committee. The committee, planning committee communication was critical. There was an agenda set before the meeting. The consultant helped us set that agenda. It was put forth before the meeting. The response at the meeting was really from the committee, what do we now need to communicate back to the congregation? So it was kind of always an ebb and flow around elements of the process.
Sister Susan?
I found with some communities it's helpful at the very beginning to really put on the agenda the development of a communication plan, and then to truly brainstorm from the committee standpoint all of the possible audiences that need to be communicated with, and then how and when might be appropriate, and who will be doing the communicating. So if you're getting to benefactors, it may be if you already have a development publication or something that's going to benefactors, maybe you would do that in the next edition, just initially putting it out there. If you have the administrator or HR person who's responsible for lay employees, what's that person's involvement in the process so that they know what to communicate and when? And if they're not involved in the process, who's going to communicate with them what it is that they can share with the employees? So it's in the bishop, or it's the, you don't want people who should know to be surprised.
That's true.
But it's also what level of information do you need to really be sharing at that time? I think with the members it's very different. From the very beginning, I think they need to be involved. I think once, and each time, as Helen said, that the planning committee has met, the members need to know, because that's where we talked about rumors. Rumors can grow even within the community. Amongst the members, when they hear that, or they live with someone who's going to a meeting and who comes home and acts like she can't share what went on at the meeting, and then it's like then you begin to speculate, and we're great speculators of what might be. And so they're in the sisters or the brothers at the mother house or wherever the meetings are being held, they also pick up, they know who's there and why they're there, but they can grow legs big time as to what really happened. So I think that whole communication is important. And for me, it's important that the committee really review whatever's going out to the members so that it does accurately portray the understanding. Because if one person is assigned to write it and sends it, whether it's the chair or someone from leadership, they may have a different perspective. And it's how is it the perspective of the whole, not the perspective of the individual. And you talked yesterday about the importance of moving from individual to team. And I think that's critical in those communications.
One of the points I think you made has to do with making connections. So as part of a communication plan, if you know there's a big newsletter going out 2 months from now to benefactors or whomever else, just recognizing that as an opportunity for communications. Does the Institute need to say anything in that communications that's going to go out anyway about what's going on? So it's making those connections with other things that are going on within the Religious Institute to make sure that there's a coherent, cohesive message about the planning process that's being distributed and managed.
And I would affirm the idea of using what's already in place. We have sponsored ministries, so we took advantage of an annual gathering of all of the administrators to inform them that we were beginning this. We didn't call a separate meeting to raise it to a level of importance that it really did not warrant in that.
Another point you made has to do with the different needs, maybe, of members who maybe live in a large congregate facility versus members who may not live in that same facility. And so, and who may potentially be affected in a different way than the members who live in the large congregate facility, especially if that facility is within the scope of a strategic property planning process. So part of what I heard you saying, beyond the greater potential maybe for rumors in that environment, is also the need for closer, better, more frequent or different somehow communications with those members who are living congregately in a large facility that's within the scope of a process.
And I think that's critically important because in working with communities who have made the decision to sell the mother house, and therefore for those who live there, that sense of where am I going to go and how will I be taken care of in the future, that begins early on, that fear. I've settled in, I'm very comfortable here, I know how life goes on here, but if we're going to sell the mother house, what does that mean to me? And so even someone who, whether it's a pastoral team or whether it's somebody from the outside who has a role working with elder members, to come in and just really spend time and to listen, because sometimes it can't be leadership because they're afraid to say to leadership what's going to happen to me, because leadership doesn't know. And yet the individual is very much afraid and is overwhelmed by what the potentials might be, the implications from some of this planning that we're doing. So I think early on, anticipating that those sisters or brothers who live in those complexes that are under study need to somehow be addressed perhaps differently and worked with in a way that they're free to express their fears and concerns. They're not going to stand up at a community meeting and say that. I mean, many won't do that, but they might do it in their small groups and at the lunch table, what have you. But someone who's actually focusing on their needs, I think, is an important component of communication. Different from what a communication plan, but it might be what about those individuals, and we might forget them.
You know, although we're approaching these educational sessions in discrete sessions, 5, much of the content is interconnected and intersects, and one example of that is managing a strategic property planning process once it's in place. That the challenges, the needs, the management needs connect directly to the roles that have been established. So, for example, if a planning team or committee has been established and has been given a role that includes making all decisions about how this process is going to unfold and what the next steps are, that presents one structure for management of the process. If, on the other hand, the role was defined differently, and let's say, for example, that the role of the planning team or committee is to make recommendations to a leadership team or a council about how they think, then that's a different level of challenges to management altogether. And then you add to that internationality, and if you're part of if a religious institute's part of an international congregation, then that carries some implications for how the process is managed too. Could you speak to that a little bit, either of you?
I think that, from my sense, in doing the communication plan, if it's an international community, the generalate is, and perhaps sister provinces in the same locale or area, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in the Americas or what have you. But that's another group that needs to be put on the list of who and how is that communication. And continuing the updates, because if a decision needs to be made by the generalate, and it has to come first to the provincial chapter and then to the generalate. If the generalate doesn't have any clue, and they're from multiple countries perhaps,
right,
and they don't have a clue, perhaps because they've never been in the United States, what might be happening here, if they've not been updated, then the delay that could have come about in making those decisions.
Yeah.
So from the international standpoint, I think it's critical to put the generalate on the communication list and a very defined plan for how and when they will be communicated with.
And it varies by institute, of course, but one potential challenge for a religious institute that's part of an international congregation could be, how are we going to manage this process to get them, the General Council, to see things our way, to see things from our perspective. In some situations, that may not be a challenge at all because of the relationships. In others, it could be a big challenge because of some of the factors that you mentioned, coming from different countries with different cultures and not really understanding, what may be going on in the U.S. with a particular religious institute. But that's all part of managing the process, I think, and it's an additional consideration that those religious institutes that are part of an international congregation have to consider as part of their overall approach to management.
I think it comes back to information, no matter what, whether you're local, as we are, and our leadership team was part of the planning committee. If that's not the case, the same thing has to happen. What information is being discovered? What are the things that are being considered? What are the questions that are being asked? So if the leadership team is not integral to the planning committee, or if it's international, you have to build an understanding, a common understanding, and that can be certainly challenging when you have different cultures. But it's true of even local situations.
I think two other groups that we might not have talked specifically about. Helen mentioned that because of their sponsored ministries, they met with the administrators. But if those are separately incorporated, I think it's how are the board members of those entities. And I would recommend that the planning committee and or leadership, whoever's the responsible group here, really develops the points to be shared with, so that it's consistent across the sponsored ministries, whether it's with the administrators and or with the board members, because somebody coming who may be these members' representative on the board, but not a part of the planning committee, she's either getting what she's getting as a member, but not necessarily as a part of the planning committee, so she may not have the same information.
I would affirm that, and for us it was my role, but it doesn't have to be the leader's role. It was a set communication to each of the groups and eventually to the board members.
So I think that just illustrates that the management of a strategic property planning process really depends on the Institute situation, whether it's part of an international congregation, whether it has sponsored ministries with separate corporate boards, or any other factor that may give rise to some aspect of management that would apply for that institute, maybe not to others.
I would affirm the give rise to. We didn't know everything when we started this, but things became, oh, what about communicating to the boards? I mean, things to pay attention and to respond in a consistent way.
I worked with one group and I heard their story of how they had failed to share the information about the closing of their school with the alums. And the alums may or may not be benefactors. The alums may not fit into any other category. And yet the alums can be a very powerful force when you tell them that they're closing their alma mater. And so the alums is another group that perhaps, depending on what, again, the buildings, the ministries that the planning process is looking at, taking in, again, that brainstorming of who might we need to think about.
That's right.
Alums are a powerful force at times.
So I think we'll end this conversation where it began, with the importance of communication as part of managing a strategic property planning process. So as we move along through this session, which focuses on managing strategic planning, property planning processes, I want to cover a few more aspects of management, beginning with generating choices, options, and alternatives. Strategic property planning that's intended to do that, to produce choices, options, and alternatives, is usually preferable. But that doesn't happen by itself. For a process to generate choices, options, and alternatives, it must be intentionally managed to do that. Generating choices requires several things. First, an overall posture of openness. If the religious institute puts up barriers from the beginning that essentially say, we can't do this, we're not interested in that, you're probably not going to get fewer choices than if you adopt an overall posture of being open to possibilities. Second is a willingness and commitment to listen to the ideas of others, to entertain them. Third, and importantly, is to always recognize that the Institute ultimately controls what it decides to do. So if it has a posture of openness which enables choices to come forward and is willing to and committed to listen to the idea of others, that does not mean that those ideas and those possibilities have to be accepted. But the more open and the more willing a religious institute is, the greater the possibility that multiple choices and options and alternatives can be developed through a strategic property planning process, and that if the institute desires that, then it has to intentionally manage the process to produce those choices and options. It also requires, producing choices and options also requires trusting the process, to trust that the process will lead to that, and to remember that in the end the institute is ultimately in control of what it decides to do. There's a tool online that goes into more detail on tips to help generate choices in strategic property planning that you may want to consult if your institute is interested in approaching strategic property planning in a way that produces choices and alternatives. The next aspect of managing a strategic property planning process I want to touch on basically has to do with keeping it on track. One way to do that, one tool to do that, is through a progress report that the Institute receives periodically from its professional advisor. That progress report, if an institute decides to establish one, is linked directly to the detailed strategic property planning process description that I spoke about earlier in this session, including the timetable for that process. The progress report would be submitted periodically in accordance with the Institute's needs, whatever those are. The
a critical one would be how frequently the Institute wishes to receive a formal progress report from its professional advisors. One of the benefits of having a progress report is that it provides early warning about emerging issues and needs that are coming up in a strategic property planning process. There's an example online of a simple progress report that religious institutes can access and tailor and modify to suit your own needs. But it, again, as with many of the tools and resources available online, they provide a starting point for an institute if on a topic that may be important to it. Another important element of staying on track is to intervene when there are signs a process may be getting off track. Looking for root causes if there's a sense that a process may be getting off track. Recognizing scope creep, which is highlighted in blue, meaning it's a term on the glossary, and Sister Susan mentioned the term creep in a conversation we had in an earlier session. What that essentially is that a project ordinarily, because it's not well defined, tends to grow and grow tentacles and go offshoots and becomes bigger or different than was originally intended, and that's commonly referred to as scope creep. So that just reinforces the need to be very clear about what the scope of a project is and to stick with and manage around that scope. Making timetable adjustments when necessary, and Sister Helen spoke to that in the conversation that we had earlier in this session, that sometimes timetable adjustments are necessary. Sometimes you don't want to automatically assume they're necessary. You want to question the need for them, but sometimes they are necessary, and when they are necessary, part of managing the process is having the flexibility to make timetable adjustments. So there are, a tool that's available online is a set of questions that you may want to ask when a strategic property planning process is off track or is perceived to be off track. And some of these have to do with the root cause of the reason why a process is off track, and whether that was an avoidable reason or an unavoidable one. So there are some questions that may be helpful to you to ask if you have a sense that once you're involved in a strategic property planning process that it may be coming off track. Another component of managing a strategic property planning process is managing professional advisor costs. Remembering that ideally the Institute would have engaged a professional advisor following a competitive solicitation, and remembering that there would be a price component of that solicitation, and there would be some level of understanding formalized in a contract or an engagement letter about the cost for the services that the professional advisor is providing. So, but that doesn't mean that that the challenges of managing professional advisor costs have gone away, because sometimes unexpected things happen that affect the original set of assumptions around which cost estimates were built, and that sometimes occurs. But whether or not that occurs, making costs a point of conversation from the beginning is a healthy thing for a religious institute to do. Also, establishing clear expectations about costs from the start is a good thing to do. One of those expectations might be the best surprise is no surprise. So if there is, for a legitimate reason, a change in the costs that were originally anticipated, the Institute wants to know that. It wants to know it as soon as the professional advisor knows that. Again, the best surprise is no surprise. There needs to be a forum to effectively manage professional advisor costs. There needs to be a forum for periodic review of plan to actual costs. whether that's incorporated into a progress report with a simple question like, are costs where you thought they would be at this point in the process, or whether it's part of a periodic meeting you have with your professional advisor. There are a number of ways to do that, but there needs to be some forum for a periodic review of planned actual costs. When there is a deviation, the reasons for that deviation need to be identified and distinguished between avoidable and unavoidable delays and or cost increases to the extent they can be. Because as I mentioned, some cost increases are unavoidable because they may have to do, for example, not with scope creep, but with the deliberate expansion of the scope of work that the Institute decides it wants or needs to do as it gets into a strategic property planning process. So the reason for the deviation has to be assessed. Another way to manage professional advisor costs is to monitor their invoices and to keep track of those and to compare those to what the Institute's understanding is of what the costs should be as best it understood it from the proposal maybe, or from its letter of engagement or contract. A couple of tools that are available online related to managing professional advisor costs include a list of questions about costs that should be asked periodically of your professional advisor. Also, there's a very simple description of minimal requirements for invoice support from professional advisors that will help provide insight into the costs, the fees of a professional advisor, and basically by getting some baseline information as part of an invoice, that helps the Institute be aware of a professional advisor's costs and to manage those costs if they need to be managed. That's not always the case, but if the Institute finds itself in a circumstance where costs are different from what they're expecting, then it needs to structure its relationship with the professional advisor from the beginning so that there is no surprise at the end, and so there's some ongoing discussion of fees. Working successfully with professional advisors beyond cost estimates and fees is a critical component of managing a strategic property planning process. That begins with establishing common goals and making sure that the professional advisors and the Institute share goals, and those goals would stem from the detailed planning process description that I described earlier, which one component of which is to articulate the Institute's goals, and those goals need to be shared by the professional advisor. Building esprit de corps, a sense of team between the planning team and the committee and the professional advisors is a successful a way to successfully work with professional advisors. After establishing common goals, there also should be the spirit of esprit de corps. Communicating honestly and effectively with professional advisors is essential. And if there's a need to raise a topic that may not be pleasant, to do that, to be honest about that, and to communicate openly and honestly with professional advisors about all aspects of a strategic property planning process. As I said before, articulating and reinforcing clear expectations is also an essential element of working successfully with professional advisors, and those could be expectations about preferred points or channels of communication. Who should the professional advisor be communicating most with? Should it be someone in leadership? Should it be the chair of the planning team or committee? Being clear about the Institute's preferred channel of communication is an important element of managing professional advisors. Adhering to the detailed strategic property planning process description is also an expectation that the Religious Institute would want to communicate to the professional advisor. At this point, the Institute has invested much time, effort, and resources to get to the point where it has this detailed strategic planning process description, and the Institute should be very clear with its professional advisors that this is the track we are on, this is the roadmap that we're following, and it's our expectation that you follow that too. And again, the best surprise is no surprise. If things happen, then we want to know that something is happening that may deviate from that detailed planning process description. The Institute needs to also be clear about its expectations related to responsiveness to the Religious Institute's needs and requests. In some cases, that may just happen naturally. In other cases, a Religious Institute may perceive that the level of responsiveness from its professional advisors is not as great as the Institute would like. And if so, if the Institute is in that position, that it would want to be very clear about its expectations for responsiveness. This could be phone calls, this could returning phone calls, this could be providing materials by agreed upon dates, and any other way that a professional advisor is responsive to the Religious Institute and its needs, because that's part of what you hired a professional advisor to do, is to be responsive to the Institute and its needs. The Institute also needs to establish clear expectations about the deliverables. That's a term that we went into in some detail related to the RFP in the prior session of this series of sessions. But the deliverables, there should be clarity in the Religious Institute's expectations that the professional advisor provide those deliverables that it agreed to provide. That needs to be very clear, and the Institute needs to make that clear. Fees and expenses, the Institute's expectations about that as well is an area in which the Institute would want to be clear. And then finally, intervening as needed. If something is awry or the Institute perceives it that way, then it needs to intervene with the professional advisor and have an honest, open conversation about what's going on and why, why the reasons that give rise to the Institute's concern. But there should be no hesitancy on the part of the Religious Institute to intervene with the professional advisor if it discovers that is needed during the strategic property planning process. A couple of tools that are available online on this topic. There is a more detailed description of expectations, tips for working with professional advisors, and questions you should never be afraid to ask professional advisors. Those are all available online as resources and tools for the Religious Institute to use as it manages a strategic property planning process. Also, there are, one of the tools online is a list of potential indicators that a professional service relationship may be in trouble or failing. That happens infrequently, I believe, but I also know that that does happen. And the Institute, being aware of signs that a relationship may be failing is an important thing, whether it's failure to return calls promptly, or to provide deliverables, or to stand by agreements. There are a series of things an institute can look to and say, this may indicate there's something going on in this relationship, and may cause the institute to have an open, honest conversation with its professional advisors to make sure that this strategic property planning process stays on track. That's all part of managing the process that the institute, again, has invested much time, effort, resources into to get to this point. That concludes the presentation of content on this fourth session of strategic property planning educational series. We'll now move to the final panel discussion in this session.
So, sisters, let's talk a little bit about working with professional advisors, which was a key component of the information that I just presented. What do you think a good relationship with a professional advisor looks like? What are characteristics of having where you have real comfort and level of trust in your professional advisor? How do you establish that? How do you get there?
I think one of the things that we experienced was actually like a shared agreement about what the process was going to look like. And even though there might be changes or adaptations, there was a common understanding of how we were going to start, how we were going to go forward. There was always the consistent relationship back to what we wanted to have happen in terms of our goals, and also in terms of what this was going to do to further the mission. And it was an ongoing conversation, always checking back, and the ability to have that consultant available. There were set times that we had for conversation or meetings, but I think it's critical that the consultant has availability either from the leadership or planning committee, however that is done, so it's not bombarding the consultant, but you have to have that clear communication and that openness.
I also think it's the honesty from the Institute standpoint, the community standpoint, of their own culture and their own way of doing things, whether it's decision making or whether it's meeting gathering or whether it's we always start with a contemplative space or whatever is the culture of the institution, because not all religious communities are alike, let's just say it mildly, and how we operate. So for consultants coming in, we respect the fact that he or she has worked with other religious communities. We're not all cut out of the same cookie cutter. So it's the ability of the consultant, the advisor, to acknowledge and to recognize and to listen, so that the way he or she might think the process needs to move, that needs to be a togetherness and working that through that process. So as Helen said, I think defining the process and being very clear about it, but I think it's the honesty. Trust comes from honesty. Excuse me. So, and I think that it's the honesty, it's the clarity, but it's also the ability of the planning committee and the Institute to ask the questions. And it's formulating those questions, and it's the ability to respond to the questions that the advisor is asking. And if it's not clear, not just to assume that he must have the answers or something, because it's really the community's, the Institute's responsibility in the decision making. So it's working through. That's why we said this in the previous session, the interviewing is so important of the possible advisors. What's the relationship? What's the feel for the individuals? And
part of building that trust is something I think you've pointed out before, and that's just not listening but hearing. And the more you get a sense that a person is listening and hearing, I think that's a building block to lead to that relationship of trust.
One of the things I was thinking too is that the process involves the planning committee leadership. It might be integral to that or not, the members of the congregation and the consultant, and it's all part of the same whole. And for us, I think it was very important that our members actually met the consultant at some point over, that this person was not in the background, that was calling the shots, and who is this person, where this person was someone who was articulating what we were articulating, and they could see that. I think that's an important aspect of working with a consultant, because it's not the consultant just working with a small group. The consultant has an impact on the entire whole.
Do you need to like your consultant personally? Is that critical, important?
I would say yes.
I think so. I mean, we might love everyone, but it's really tough to work with someone you don't like.
Well, I had to ask. But I think that, you are working around a common set of goals.
Right.
And a common and shared. interest, and you're working over a long period of time. So some of that relationship, establishing a relationship beyond trust, just a little bit of a personal relationship, I'm not sure it's absolutely critical, but it's definitely helpful.
And you mentioned that subjective piece in the selection. You can't ignore that.
Yeah.
It's part of human nature.
One of the questions that's on one of the tools or questions or indicators of it might be a right fit is, does the person sometimes make you laugh? I mean, that's not a big thing, but if it is an indicator that this person has a sense of humor, maybe, or you can relate to them on another level.
One of the things,
it's part of the subjective part.
But it's funny that you say that, because if you were going to ask us if we were at the end of this and you were going to ask if there are any final comments, I was going to say you must maintain a sense of humor through this whole process. If we don't have a sense of humor, it goes with our humility.
Yeah.
But it's the ability to laugh and to enjoy. And if you can't enjoy being with the consultant because you don't like him or her, it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
Because you're going to share mealtime,
Yeah.
you're going to share experiences. You need to be able to laugh.
Yeah.
And you need to be able to talk about things other than just this focus.
And laugh at the dilemmas or the mistakes that pop up in a way. You know, get over it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you'll stop. And that's deadly.
What happens when things don't go so well? Either, and I'm not talking about liking your consultant, I'm talking about it's just not going well for whatever reason, and in whatever shape that takes. What's that look like, and what advice would you have for religious institutes that are at a point where they're thinking this is not working?
Don't ignore it. You have to realize analyze what is not working. Is it the lack of communication? Is it going off on a track that wasn't agreed to? Always going back to the scope, the values. If that's clearly defined at the beginning of the process, trust your instincts and say, well, where is this falling apart? And to identify it. Talk with the consultant. It may be something that can be, reconfigured in some ways. Maybe one attempt to do that. If it is communication, or if there's rising costs and things like that that were never even discussed, put that forward. And if it can't change, you have to end it. Otherwise, the process will be deadly.
I also think it's important. It may be the honesty again comes into play, because it may be that I'm kind of feeling that it's not going well, but I'm not sure why. Mm-hmm. Then I need to check out. And truly check it out with the other members of the team, whoever the team is and who's involved in this. And then to look at why do we think it's not going well, to be very clear in articulating that. And it is, I agree with Helen, then it's talking with the consultant or the advisor, and to express what our feelings are, our thoughts are about that. And to say, is there a solution? Or maybe this isn't working. This wasn't a good match. Whatever might be the issue. And I think also I would advise institutes to go back and look at the contract or the letter of engagement and saying, what are our rights and our responsibilities here? Because I think that's another piece that you want to know up front. What have you agreed to? What has been agreed to by the engagement? And is there something here that is missing? Or did we not have an accurate and clear understanding of something that was there?
Even after doing all that and thinking about it, consulting with others, looking at the contracts, it takes courage, doesn't it? To if you're at a point where now you believe something is not right and you can't ignore it, it takes courage to have that conversation that you just alluded to that needs to happen. What advice would you have for leaders or planning team chairs or whoever it is that's going to have this conversation?
Again, depending on the size of the committee and how the committee has been functioning, or the leadership, who's been the signers on the engagement, 2 or 3 or 4 people may need to sit with the individual or individuals and really have that conversation, and then to look at whether it's something that there's changes that can be made, and it can continue on and get back on course, or it will be best for all that we end this relationship. And that's a toughie for leadership to do, I think, because in any situation of because you're admitting that perhaps you were wrong, and that's not what leaders want to do with their members, and that we're going to have to abort this process and move forward with whatever it might be. But why are we doing this? We're doing it for the sustainability of our mission. And if this isn't going to get us there, then we do need to have the courage to say, this isn't working, or we're making these changes to see if this is going to work. And that may be done on a, let's try this for the next 2 months or 3 months, and if it doesn't get better. And also truly hearing and listening to what the consultant is saying.
I would affirm that the courage really comes from the shared perception. If it's not just your own perception, but other people on the committee or other groups are saying this is not going well. That gives you a sense of courage. The other thing is that if it's a single perception, sometimes you have a person who is like, let's get this done, and it's not getting done fast enough. So you put that forward, there's an explanation of why it's not getting done fast enough, and you move on. But I think once there is a clear-cut issue, this isn't working, the hardest thing is to think we've made a mistake here in the choice, and we have to start all over again. And I would say if there is that need to stop, don't hesitate to try to start over again, because otherwise you will never get to that point of looking to the future of the mission.
And I don't want to give this topic too much attention, because I believe that most professional advisors perform well. I believe that most relationships are good, and in most cases, the Religious Institute and the advisor, when the project is over, walk away both feeling good about what was accomplished. But the point of this is that that's not always the case. Sometimes things don't go well. And if an institute finds itself in one of those times, then it needs to act. So while this conversation may apply to a minority of the religious institutes who are watching this, nonetheless, it's an important part of managing the strategic property planning process, to manage the professional advisor, and if things aren't going well, don't hesitate from intervening, because that advisor works for the institute, and in the end, the institute decides. With that, we'll end this final conversation in strategic planning, property planning session number 4. Sister Helen Carney, Sister Susan Shorston, thank you.
Thank you, Skip. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Susan.
As we bring a conclusion to strategic property planning session 4, I want to go through a few of the major takeaways from this session that viewers should know. First, take the time required to carefully think through the strategic property planning process. Second, and in connection with that, develop a detailed planning process description based on this thinking. Third, invest in careful planning of planning team or committee meetings. Fourth, apply simple project management principles to keep strategic property planning on track. 5, develop and implement a communications plan and strategy. 6, engage in the process from a posture of openness so that the strategic property planning process produces choices. 7, set clear expectations for professional advisors and maintain clear and honest communications with them. 8, recognize the signs that a planning process may be getting off track. So those are the main takeaways from this 4th session. On the screen now is a list of the practical tools and resources that have been developed to support the content of this session. These are all available through the website, and there are 19 of them, as you can see, in 20 including the glossary of key terms that are relevant to this session 4. All of these practical tools and resources are available on the Tending the Vineyard page in the NRRO section of the USCCB website at usccb.org. Thank you. And next up is the fifth and final session, strategic property planning session, entitled Reaping the Fruits. This concludes this strategic property planning session. It's been our great pleasure to bring this session to you. We hope you found the materials presented interesting and the accompanying conversations helpful. As Sister Stephanie mentioned in her introduction, these sessions on strategic property planning were made possible through a grant from the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation. Again, I'm Skip Hedger, and on behalf of Sisters Helen Carney and Susan Shorston, we thank you sincerely for taking time to watch this educational session on strategic property planning for religious institutes in the U.S. We hope to be with you again as you watch one of the other 4 educational sessions on strategic property planning.